Lesson 19, Education. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, by Emily Dickinson. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Learning is a pathway to understanding truth, also known as revelation. Emily Dickinson, a famous poet who lived around the same time as the pioneer families we have been learning about in this unit, is saying that telling the truth is best done generally or gradually. She uses a metaphor comparing truth to light that can dazzle us or blind us. What do you think? Do you think the truth should be stated matter-of-factly, to the point, and directly? Do you think there are some situations where the truth should be approached gently or in a roundabout rather than head-on? Learning often looks different from person to person. If you are using this curriculum, you likely homeschool. Someone else might go to a classroom full of their peers and learn together. Whether you learn on your own, with kids your age, or one-on-one with a mentor or a teacher, you are genuinely wired to seek truth and be dazzled by the wonder of its discovery. Now we're going to talk about the teacher.
Is it ready? Okay, the teacher. While one-room schoolhouses did exist during pioneer times, they weren't always available, nor were they required until the early 1900s. Before then, education was something of a secondary priority to the more pressing work of surviving off the land. School was taught in terms that allowed breaks during important seasons, such as planting in the spring and harvesting in the fall. Going to school in the 1800s was a privilege, not available in every community or situation. If a hard-working family could find a way to spare their children's helping hands to send them to school, there was still the matter of funding a school, finding a teacher, and then supporting their wages. This wasn't something that could be done by just one family. In the early years of westward expansion, families accepted the fact that it took time to establish the lives they wanted, not just for their children, but their grandchildren. Teachers did not have unions, consistent salaries, or a principal to send an unruly or disrespectful pupil to. Instead, teachers were sent out into small towns and communities alone, and a few years of education under their belts and a bright future of about between $55 to $87 a year to look forward to, equivalent to under $2,000 today. Communities would advertise for a teacher and donate the land and building materials to make a community schoolhouse. Once a teacher arrived, the families paid his salary and often took turns hosting him in their homes. While you might imagine that most teachers were women, this was often not the case, especially in earlier schools. Men were the more common educators, as most women were usually busy raising their families and taking care of their homesteads. It was also important for the teacher to keep order. Older teen boys could be strong, and the teacher was expected to discipline the students. If a male teacher could not be found, more common during the Civil War, a woman might be selected, though she sometimes had a more difficult time managing the students and was usually paid about half of what a man was paid. Think about the pay and work life of a teacher in the 1800s. Would you work for that pay in those conditions? Discuss why you think women were paid less. The schoolhouse. The schools of the 19th century were very different from the vast hallways of bright classrooms with fluorescent lights that we have today. They were called a one-room schoolhouse. because they were usually just one single room filled with desks and open back chairs. There were no lights other than the windows, no heat other than a stove in the corner, and only a few books that were shared among the pupils instead of a library. There was no bathroom other than an outhouse a distance away from the building, and the only snacks were what a child or student might bring in their lunch pail. The days were often long, and the schoolmaster was likely strict. Schoolhouses had anywhere from just a couple of students to 30 or more of all ages, though it was not uncommon to have members drop off during busier seasons when children were needed at the house to help Ma or Pa. While it might seem difficult to keep children of all ages interested in a lesson, school only went up to about an 8th grade level. At that point, children were too valuable to let go of the all day long. The younger ages that were in a class together were placed in the classroom according to their abilities. Older students who needed less help might be at the back, while younger students or troublemakers were near the front, where they could be supervised more carefully. When not in use, the schoolhouse might be used for dances and other gatherings by the entire community. The students. Students came into the school at all different levels with a range of experience and skills. Some were taught at home by their parents as much as possible, or had been in school before they had traveled west. Others were young and brand new to the world of education. There also might be older students that had never had the opportunity to go to school, nor were their parents educated enough to be able to teach them. This is one of the reasons that a one-room schoolhouse worked so well for over 200 years. They allowed children of all ages to come regardless of their skill level or ability, and systems were in place to keep the day organized and structured. Older students often helped the younger ones by showing flashcards, helping them hold their pencils properly, or doing resuscitation or memory work with them. Older students were often chosen or voluntold for duty as monitors. These students did a lot of work, the work of a teacher, without any of the pay. Good character, stewardship, hard work, and discipleship were rewarded in the classroom. Because of this discipleship approach and group lessons, by the time younger students were ready to complete the lessons of the older ones, they had heard it so many times from resuscitation and memory work that they knew it by heart, even without having heard the lessons for themselves. The lessons. Before there were learning outcomes, there was still a high level of expectation and discipline required in school. Without easy access to paper, most work was done either on a slate board or mentally. Memorization and recitation were the main way the lessons were taught by the teacher, and consequently learned by the student. Students were expected to sit still and complete their work with diligence and focus. The main focus of the school lesson was reading, pronunciation, good penmanship, and arithmetic. The Bible was one of the main textbooks used, as it was something that most families had at home. Let's take a look at the typical school day in the 1800s. A day in the life. Claire was 8 years old, and she had walked to school with her older sister, Ada. Her brother was not allowed to come to school today because Pa needed him at the farm to help build a fence. Claire took off her bonnet and hung her lunch pail on the hook as she entered the schoolroom. She made her way to her spot, about 2 rows back from the front, where the youngest students who couldn't read yet would sit. Class started with the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer, 2 things she knew by heart. She stood up and recited the words she knew so well, and then she sat down to listen to the Bible lesson. Spelling and grammar were next. Today was a spelling test, and one by one, students were called on to stand up and spell the words out loud. Claire stood up and carefully and clearly spelled thicket. 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 The schoolmaster nodded his head in curt approval. and she sat down once again, relieved to have gotten it right. As part of her grammar lesson, she had to parse a sentence on her slate board, where she had to explain the meaning and function of each word. Reading was next, and when, with so few books in the classroom, the reader passed around from student to student to read aloud. Arithmetic problems were given out. Claire's older sister, Ada, was called upon to do her work on the board at the front, so the schoolmaster could see if she missed any steps. Claire watched Ada swallow in nervousness as she walked up to the front of the room. But her writing was clear and her work was flawless. Ada walked back to her desk with her head held a little higher. Eli had been talking in class again. He was older, and his pa said this was his last year at school. At lunch, when all the other kids went outside to play, Eli stayed in the classroom and scrubbed the floor with linseed oil. He looked miserable, but Claire was certain he wouldn't be talking the rest of the week at least. The truth was, he was probably acting up because he was disappointed that he wouldn't be going to school next term. Life on the farm was hard work and often lonely. Most of the children loved going to school, playing at recess, visiting during lunch, and getting out of chores. One day, Claire knew her mom would need her at home, and she would have to say goodbye to the little schoolhouse, but not yet. School was different than it is today in many ways, from the buildings and tools to the lessons and the way they are taught. While home education was possible, the truth was that it was rare. Many parents had been educated themselves and could not teach their children. While we sometimes view school through a lens of disinterest or boredom, it is a distinct privilege that not everyone has. Not everyone gets to grow up and know how to read, write, and how things work the way they do, while also understanding the stories of our past and how they are affected who we are today. May we recognize the dazzling wonder of learning something new and be hungry for more. May God instill in us the character, the determination, and the desire to seek truth in all its brilliance and unveil it for ourselves and others. And may we be filled with gratitude and we learn and explore the world around us and be humble enough to accept that there is always something more to learn.
Is it over?
Mm-hmm.